Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Chidester. Today is Monday, I think March 15th. I'm not exactly sure. It's the apocalypse, it's coronavirus, and we're all hunkered down. And it's the perfect opportunity to share some of the memories that I have of Don Marshall. And this message that I have is a message specifically for Brother Marshall's family and any students that he had, and anyone else who wants to learn some incredible life lessons. Don Marshall is a humanities professor that I had back in 1991 when I was a lowly freshman at Brigham Young University. And I'll never forget the first time that I walked into his class. He had this large auditorium. There were 300 students in that class, and he had 3 different classes of freshmen. So he had about 900 students each semester. And I remember the first time that I heard him speak, he had a very significant speech impediment. And he never mentioned it. He never talked about it. He just went on and spoke with no thought of that. And I was struck by how his speech impediment did not hold him back. And he was such a kind person. He was so passionate about the arts. And I remember one time the very first day of class, he asked if there would please be 10 or 15 of us that would stay behind class to just visit with us. And I was so curious. I wondered what he would want to talk to people about. So I stayed behind. And he whipped out this giant camcorder, and he started interviewing each person. And he'd put the camcorder on one person, and he'd look at me and he'd say, "Hello, what's your name?" And I said, "Oh, I'm Lisa Anderson. I'm from Edmond, Oklahoma, and I like to read and hike, and I like to cook." And he'd say, "Well, it's so nice to meet you, Lisa Anderson from Edmond, Oklahoma." And he went through each person and would learn our name and something about us. And what I noticed is over the course of that semester, Don Marshall was able to call on by name probably about 70% of that audience, of those class members. And I was so inspired and impressed that out of 300 students, he could memorize that many names. And not only that he could memorize those names, that he actually cared to memorize the names and find out a little bit about us. So that by itself was impressive. And I could just stop this story right there and say, what an impressive professor who memorized freshman names. But it goes much further. That semester, I had a friend of mine that went to the humanities class with me. His name was Daryl. And Daryl didn't really like humanities, and he stopped going to Brother Marshall's class. And I'll never forget, probably maybe 6 weeks into that semester, my friend Daryl came and sat by me at the cafeteria. I think it was the Morris Center cafeteria. And he sat down beside me. He said, "Lisa, you are never gonna guess who just came to my dorm room." And I said, "Who?" He said, "Professor Don Marshall." I said, "Professor Marshall? What did he go to your dorm room for?" He wanted to find out why I stopped coming to his class and what he could do to make his lectures more interesting so that I would start coming back to his lectures. We were amazed. Here we were, two 18-year-old lowly freshman who saw this professor who cared so deeply that not only did he want to learn our names and be able to call on us by name, that he actually made the effort to go visit my friend Daryl at his dorm room to see what he could do to make his lessons more interesting so that one of those 900 students would start coming to his lectures again. So I was so inspired by this professor that throughout my life, I always remembered the example that this man set for me and learned the lesson of learning people's names. So anyway, as the years went by, anytime that I would teach a lesson in Sunday school about Jesus Christ and the parable of the lost sheep, where there's the picture of Christ holding the lost sheep, I would always think about Professor Marshall holding his students, that he loved his students so much and he knew them all by name and knew them so well that even when one student was missing, he would go and find that student. So, sorry. Anyway, many years passed, and in 2011, I believe it was, so I had Professor Marshall in 1991 and in 2011, so that's about 20 years later, I kept thinking about him, Professor Marshall, and thought so much about the example that he set and how much I loved him, how much I had learned from him, how important his example was in my life and how dear he was to me. And I thought, you know, I need to write down the story of what happened that freshman year and just how incredible of a person he was. So I decided to go home and write down the story and send it off to the Ensign, or maybe to the BYU alumni magazine. And I was so driven to do this that when I got home, I told all my family, my small children at the time, they were all little, grade schoolers, sorry, your dad's gonna have to make dinner. I've got something to do. And I hunkered down in my office and I just started writing down all of these memories of Professor Marshall. And that night, when I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking, what if my story doesn't get published? What if Professor Marshall never knows what an impact he had on my life? And I realized he needed to hear from me personally. So I woke up the next morning and looked on the internet for Don Marshall, Provo, Utah, and I think 5 Don Marshalls popped up. And I called the very first one that I found, and the first Don Marshall that answered the phone, he said, "Hello?" And it was that speech impediment that I had remembered so well from 20 years previous. And I said, "Professor Marshall?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Hi, my name is Lisa Anderson Chidester. I know that you don't know who I am, but I was one of your students a long time ago, and I just wanted to call and tell you how much I love you and why you are so important to me." And he said, "Me? Well, why? What did I do?" And so I told him what he did, how he memorized our names and how he went and knocked on Daryl's dorm room door. And he had no memory of knocking on Daryl's door, but he did say, well, I did try very hard to memorize the names of all of my students. And he said, I am so glad that you called me today. He said, you know, for the past 2 weeks, I have been feeling such a severe depression, feeling that that I am forgotten, that when I go up on the BYU campus, nobody knows my name anymore. And he said, over the 40 years that I was a professor at BYU, I learned over 25,000 names. And now nobody even knows who I am. He said, most of my siblings have Alzheimer's disease. And he said, I know that it's just around the corner for me. And he said, I am so desperate to prevent that from happening to me. And I'm doing everything in my power to keep my brain intact. And he said, I can't tell you how your words mean everything to me, because I feel so very forgotten and alone. And he said, I just feel like Heavenly Father sent you to remind me that I am loved and remembered. And I was so grateful that morning, that out of the 20 years that I had thought about him, that I had felt compelled to call him during his time of mental and emotional anguish, and I was able to give him back a gift that he needed during a very sad time, and to just have that sweet and precious exchange. And that out of the 25,000 students that he had, I got to be privileged enough to have that conversation with Professor Marshall. And he still remains to this day one of the most amazing human beings that I have ever known. I love him so dearly. He is just a remarkable person, and I'm so grateful for the example and influence and Christ-like person. He just is a beautiful, beautiful person. I'm just so grateful that I got to be his student back in 1991. So anyway, I hope that anyone else who had him as a student, or any family member that also has a story to share about Brother Don Marshall, I encourage you to also share a memory of him. Again, my name is Lisa Anderson Chidester, and thanks everyone for letting me share. Take care. Bye-bye.